The smell of sweat and fear filled the air as Thomas Reed walked through the bustling slave market on Haven. The frontier world's three suns beat down mercilessly, making the whole place feel like an oven. He pulled his collar up to cover his nose, trying to block out the stench of unwashed bodies and despair. Thomas hadn't planned to visit the slave market. As captain of the merchant vessel Star Wanderer, he usually stuck to legitimate cargo runs between human colonies, but his ship needed repairs, and Haven was the only port within range. He'd heard stories about this place, but had never seen it with his own eyes. The market spread out before him like a nightmare come to life. Beings of all species were chained in rows, their faces blank with hopelessness. Guards with shock batons walked between the lines, keeping order with casual cruelty. Thomas's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept walking. Getting himself arrested wouldn't help anyone. That's when he saw her. She stood on a raised platform with several other aliens, but something about her caught his eye. Her skin had a soft, silvery sheen that seemed to catch the light. Her large eyes were a deep purple, and delicate markings ran down the sides of her face. A starborn, Thomas realized. He'd heard of their species, but had never seen one in person. The auctioneer, a fat man with cybernetic eyes, grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. Next up, a prime specimen of starborn stock. Young, healthy, and trained in household duties. Starts at 5,000 credits. Thomas watched as the alien woman kept her head high, even as rough hands prodded at her. Her chains rattled as she was turned this way and that, but her expression remained dignified. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. The bidding started. Thomas listened with growing horror as various buyers called out prices. He recognized some of them. Owners of pleasure houses, mining operations, and worse. The price climbed steadily as they competed for her. 15,000, called out a man Thomas knew ran fighting pits in the Outer Rim. The alien woman's face showed a flicker of fear for the first time. Thomas didn't plan what happened next. His hand went up almost on its own. 20,000. The crowd turned to look at him. The auctioneer's cyber eyes whirred as they focused on Thomas. 20,000 from the human gentleman. Do I hear 25? The pit fighter glared at Thomas but stayed silent. The price was already high for a single slave. Going once, going twice, sold to the human for 20,000 credits. Thomas felt sick as he handed over his credit chip. This was most of his savings, money he'd been planning to use for ship upgrades. But as he watched the alien woman being led down from the platform, he knew he couldn't have lived with himself if he'd walked away. The slave handlers brought her to him, along with her ownership documents. Up close, he could see that her silver skin was marked with old scars. Her purple eyes met his, showing no emotion. She probably had too many masters to expect kindness from a new one. "What's your name?" Thomas asked quietly. She bowed her head. "This one is called Lyra, Master." "Lyra," he said her name softly, then looked around the market. Everywhere he looked, he saw suffering being bought and sold like cargo. His jaw tightened. "Come with me." He led her through the crowds, past the pens and auction blocks, until they reached the spaceport. The Star Wanderer sat on her landing struts, her hull scratched but sturdy. Thomas's first officer, Mark, waited at the cargo ramp. Mark's eyes widened when he saw Lyra. "Captain, what's this about?" Later, Thomas said shortly, leading Lyra up the ramp. He took her to his cabin and closed the door. She stood with her head bowed, waiting for orders. Instead, Thomas pulled out a datapad and began typing. After a moment, he handed it to her. "These are your freedom papers. I'm registering them now. You're not a slave anymore, Lyra. You're free." She stared at the datapad, then at him, her purple eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time, he saw real emotion cross her face: confusion, fear, and something that might have been hope. "I don't understand," she whispered. Thomas smiled sadly. "You will. Welcome aboard the Star Wanderer, Lyra, as a free woman. Lyra sat on the medical bed in the Star Wanderer's small infirmary, watching as the ship's doctor removed her slave collar. The old woman worked carefully, her weathered hand steady as she disabled the shock circuits before cutting through the metal band. The collar fell away with a quiet click, leaving a pale line around Lyra's silver neck. "There you go, dear," the doctor said, applying a healing gel to the marked skin. "I'm Rose, by the way. Been patching up this crew for 10 years now." Lyra touched her bare neck, her fingers trembling. For the first time in 15 years, she felt naked without the collar's weight. Freedom, she was learning, was a terrifying thing. The ship hummed around them as it broke away from Haven's atmosphere. Through the infirmary window, Lyra watched the slave market shrink until it vanished among Haven's sprawling cities. She had expected to feel relief, but instead, she felt lost. The door slid open, and Thomas entered. He had changed from his market clothes into a simple captain's uniform, the Star Wanderer's patch on his shoulder. "How is she, Rose?" "Healthy enough, considering. Some old injuries, nothing serious, but she needs real food and rest." Rose patted Lyra's shoulder and left them alone. Thomas pulled up a chair, keeping a respectful distance. "I know this must be overwhelming. You don't have to decide anything right now, but we should talk about what happens next." Lyra forced herself to meet his eyes. Her former masters had hated when slaves looked directly at them, but Thomas didn't seem to mind. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "Nothing." Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're not my slave, Lyra. You're not anyone's slave. The freedom papers are real and registered. You can leave at our next port if you want, or you can stay and work as a paid crew member. It's your choice." Choice. Another terrifying word. Lyra looked down at her hands, seeing the small scars from years of servitude. "I don't know how to be free," she admitted. "No one does at first, but you'll learn." Thomas smiled slightly. "For now, why don't we start with getting you settled? We have a spare cabin, and Rose can help you find some clothes." As if on cue, the ship's intercom crackled. "Captain to the bridge," Mark's voice called. "We've got a situation with the Port Authority." Thomas stood. "Duty calls. Take your time, Lyra. Rose will show you to your cabin when you're ready." After he left, Lyra explored her new cabin with wonder. It was small but clean, with a real bed and a private bathroom. She found clothes in the storage unit, simple shipboard wear, but made of soft, sturdy fabric. No slave rags or revealing outfits like her previous masters had forced her to wear. Later, she stood in front of the cabin's small mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The silver-skinned woman in the reflection wore clean clothes and had no collar. Her purple eyes looked uncertain but alert. She touched the mirror, remembering her mother's face from long ago. What would she think, seeing her daughter free? A knock at the door made her jump. It was Mark, the first officer. "Captain's called a crew meeting. You should come too." Lyra followed him to the ship's small mess hall. The crew sat around a table. Rose, the engineer Jim, the pilot Anne, and a few others she hadn't met. Thomas stood at the head of the table. "Everyone, this is Lyra. She's joining us as a potential crew member." Thomas looked around the table. "I know this is unusual, but I expect her to be treated with the same respect as any other crew member. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave at the next port. Clear?" The crew nodded, some looking curious, others uncertain. Rose smiled warmly at Lyra and patted the empty seat beside her. As Lyra sat down, Thomas began discussing their next cargo run. She listened, trying to understand the ship's operations. A crew member. Not a slave, but a crew member. The words felt strange in her mind, like a language she was just beginning to learn. Anne passed her a cup of hot tea. The simple gesture, being served instead of serving, brought unexpected tears to Lyra's eyes. She blinked them away and wrapped her hands around the warm cup, feeling its heat seep into her fingers. For the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, This freedom might be real. 3 months passed aboard the Star Wanderer like a dream. Lyra stood at her station on the bridge, monitoring the ship's energy systems. Her fingers moved confidently over the controls, adjusting power levels as they prepared to exit jump space. The work came naturally to her. Starborn had always been sensitive to energy fields, though her former masters had never cared about such talents. Jump exit in 30 seconds. Anne called from the pilot's seat. Lyra, how are the shields looking? Power levels at 98%. Lyra replied, still marveling at how easily the crew accepted her input. Holding steady. The ship shuddered as it returned to normal space. Through the view screen, Lyra saw the trading station hanging against the stars like a giant metal flower. Dozens of ships moved around it, their running lights twinkling in the darkness. Thomas entered the bridge, checking readings over everyone's shoulders. When he reached Lyra's station, he smiled. Good work keeping the shield stable through the jump. You're getting better at this every day. His praise made her chest warm, though she tried not to show it. These past months had taught her that humans could be kind, but she still struggled to trust her new reality. Every morning, she woke expecting to find herself back in chains. Later, in the mess hall, Rose sat next to Lyra during dinner. The doctor had become something of a mentor, teaching her about human customs and shipboard life. You're looking better, Rose said, spooning up her soup, starting to get some meat on your bones. The food here is good, Lyra said. She remembered years of slave rations, tasteless protein paste, and recycled water. Everything here is good. Rose's eyes softened. Want to talk about it? You've been quiet lately. Lyra stirred her soup, gathering courage. I had a dream last night about my home world before the raiders came. We lived in crystal towers that caught the light of 3 moons. My mother was a teacher of energy arts. She paused, fighting back old pain. I was only 6 when they took us. Oh, child. Rose touched her hand gently. How long were you? 15 years. 4 different masters before. She glanced across the mess hall, where Thomas sat discussing cargo manifests with Mark. Before him. He's a good man, Rose said. Stubborn as a space mule sometimes, but good. Lyra nodded, watching Thomas laugh at something Mark said. She'd begun to notice things about him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how he always checked on each crew member during his rounds, the gentle way he spoke to her. The ship's alarm suddenly blared, making everyone jump. Captain to the bridge. Anne's voice came over the intercom. We've got company. They rushed to the bridge. On the view screen, a sleek black ship had appeared, its weapons ports open. Lyra felt her blood freeze as she recognized the design. A slaver vessel. They're hailing us, Anne reported. Thomas stood tall. On screen, a harsh face appeared, cybernetically enhanced, like many slaver captains. Merchant vessel Star Wanderer. We detect starborn life signs aboard. That's stolen property you're carrying. Return it, and we'll let you go without trouble. Lyra felt her legs go weak. Property. That's all she was to them. She waited for Thomas to give her up. It would be the sensible thing, one life against his whole crew. But Thomas's voice was cold as space when he replied. There's no property here, just my crew. And if you want any of them, you'll have to go through me first. The slaver captain sneered. Have it your way. The screen went dark. Battle stations, Thomas ordered. Lyra, get to engineering. We'll need every bit of power you can give us. She ran to her station, heart pounding. Through her connection to the ship's energy fields, she felt the weapons charging, the shields strengthening. The crew moved around her with practiced efficiency, preparing for fight or flight. This was the moment, she realized. The true test of her freedom. Not just Thomas's words, but his willingness to defend them. To defend her. For the first time since her childhood, Lyra felt something spark inside her. Not just hope, but determination. She wasn't property. She was crew. and she would fight to keep her freedom. The Star Wanderer shook as another blast hit their shields. Lyra's hands flew over the engineering controls, channeling power between systems. Her silver skin gleamed with sweat as she pushed her natural abilities to their limit, feeling the energy flows through the ship like streams of light. "Shields at 40%. Mark shouted from the bridge through the intercom. "We can't take much more of this." The slaver ship was faster, better armed. They had already hit the Star Wanderer's engines twice, slowing them down. Each impact made Lyra's heart skip. She knew what would happen if they were caught. "Lyra," Thomas's voice came through her private channel. "We need options. Can you sense anything about their ship?" She closed her eyes, extending her awareness through the energy fields around them. The slaver ship blazed in her mind like an angry red star, but there was something. "Their shield generator," she said suddenly. "It's putting out irregular pulses, if we time it right." "Tell me what to do," Thomas said without hesitation. "When I give the signal, fire everything at their port side. There's a point where their shields flicker, barely a second long." She heard Thomas relaying orders. The Star Wanderer turned, presenting its strongest shields to the enemy. Lyra sank deeper into her connection with the ship's systems, watching the energy patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. The slaver ship fired again. The blast rocked their ship, and warning alarms screamed through the corridors. "Shields at 25%. Mark's voice was tense. Lyra barely heard him. The energy patterns were aligning, the flickering pulse in the enemy's shields growing stronger. "Almost. Almost. Now," she shouted. The Star Wanderer's weapons erupted. Lyra poured every bit of spare power into them, using her starborn abilities to focus the energy into a perfect spike. For a crucial fraction of a second, the slavers' shields wavered. Their shots punched through. The slaver ship's port side erupted in a cascade of explosions. Their weapons went dark, and their engines sputtered out. Direct hit. Anne's jubilant voice filled the ship. "They're dead in space." Lyra sagged against her console, drained but triumphant. She felt Thomas's pride and relief through the intercom. "Outstanding work, everyone. Especially you, Lyra. You just saved all our lives." But the moment of victory was short-lived. Through her energy sense, Lyra felt something wrong. The slaver ship's reactor was becoming unstable. The damage had been more severe than intended. "Captain," she called urgently. "Their reactor, it's going critical." "Anne, get us out of here, maximum speed," Thomas ordered. The Star Wanderer's engines roared as they pulled away. Behind them, the slaver ship began to break apart, secondary explosions rippling along its hull. Lyra watched through the aft sensors as the ship that had threatened to drag her back into slavery disappeared in a final massive explosion. When it was over, Lyra found herself in the observation lounge, staring at the distant debris field. She felt Thomas approach before she heard him. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I killed them," she whispered. "All those people. They were slavers. They would have sold you back into bondage or killed us all." "I know, but I never thought I would." She turned to face him. "I never thought I would be strong enough to fight back." Thomas stepped closer, his expression gentle. "You've always been strong, Lyra. You survived 15 years of slavery without losing your spirit. That's stronger than any warrior I've ever known." Something in his voice made her heart beat faster. They stood close now, closer than they'd ever been. She could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the concern and something else in his expression. "I couldn't let them take me," she said softly. "Not when I finally found." She stopped, afraid to finish the thought. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. His hand was warm against her silver skin. "Found what?" "A home," she whispered. "People worth fighting for." They stood in silence, the stars wheeling past the observation window, the distance between them growing smaller with each breath. For the first time since her childhood, Lyra felt completely safe, And for the first time in her new freedom, she felt something else. The beginning of love. The spaceport on Earth was bigger than anything Lyra had ever seen. Hundreds of ships dotted the landing fields, and the city beyond stretched to the horizon. She stood at the Star Wanderer's viewport, watching ground crews scurry around like busy insects. "Ready?" Thomas asked, coming to stand beside her. He looked different in his Earth clothes, sharper, more formal. Lyra smoothed down her new dress, a simple blue thing that Rose had helped her choose. "Your family. Will they?" "They'll love you," he said, but she heard the slight uncertainty in his voice. The ground car took them through the city to a quiet neighborhood of old houses with real gardens. Thomas's family home was a 2-story building with white walls and green shutters. Lyra's heart pounded as they walked up the path. The door opened before they reached it. A woman with Thomas's brown eyes stepped out, followed by a tall man with gray hair. "Tommy," the woman called, hurrying to hug him. "Mom, Dad," Thomas said, stepping back. "This is Lyra. She's part of my crew." Lyra saw the moment of shock on their faces when they noticed her silver skin and purple eyes. Thomas's mother recovered first, offering a careful smile. "Welcome to Earth, dear. I'm Mary, and this is John." Inside, the house was full of family. Thomas's younger sister Emma, his uncle Bill, cousins, and family friends. Some were openly curious about Lyra, others politely distant. A few barely hid their disapproval. "So," Uncle Bill said during dinner, his voice loud after several drinks. "Tommy boy, when were you going to tell us you bought yourself an alien?" The table went silent. Lyra's hands trembled in her lap. "I didn't buy anyone," Thomas said quietly, but with steel in his voice. "Lyra is a free woman and a valued member of my crew." "Free?" Bill scoffed. "Everyone knows what the Starborn are. Servants, slaves. It's all they're good for." "Bill," John mourned, but the damage was done. Lyra stood up so quickly her chair almost fell. "Excuse me," she whispered, fleeing to the garden. The night air was cool on her face as she tried to stop her tears. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, expecting Thomas. Instead, it was his mother. Mary sat on a garden bench and patted the space beside her. After a moment, Lyra sat. "I'm sorry about Bill," Mary said. "He's always been a fool, and age hasn't improved him. He's not wrong about what people think of us," Lyra said softly. "The Starborn were warriors once, scholars. Now most humans only see slaves. Most humans are idiots." Mary's blunt words startled a laugh from Lyra. The older woman smiled. "I've seen how my son looks at you, and how you look at him." Lyra felt her cheeks warm. We haven't. Love's not always easy," Mary continued. "When I married John, some people still thought mixing races was wrong. We didn't care." She took Lyra's hand, examining the silver skin. "Different species will be harder. But if it's real love, it's worth fighting for." Inside the house, they heard raised voices. Thomas was arguing with his uncle, defending Lyra, defending their relationship, whatever it was becoming. "He's a good man," Lyra said. "Like his father. Like you." Mary squeezed her hand. "Come back inside. Let them see you're not afraid. Let them see who you really are." They returned to find the dining room transformed. Bill was gone. Thomas stood by the fireplace, his face tight with anger. But Emma had brought out old family pictures and was showing them to Rose, who had joined them for dinner. John was telling Jim about his days in the merchant fleet. The atmosphere had shifted from tense to merely awkward. Thomas immediately came to Lyra's side. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "We can leave." "No." Lyra straightened her shoulders. "Your mother invited me to see the pictures. I want to stay." She saw pride and something deeper in his eyes. Together, they joined Emma by the photos. As Lyra listened to stories of Thomas's childhood, she felt something settle in her heart. This wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was a beginning. and she was done running from beginnings. The message came 3 weeks after their visit to Earth. Lyra was running diagnostics and engineering when Anne called her to the bridge. A sleek white ship had appeared on their sensors, its design unlike anything Lyra had seen before. "They're asking for you by name," Thomas said, his expression worried. "They say they're Starborn." Lyra's heart stopped for a moment. She hadn't seen another free Starborn since her childhood. The white ship's elegant lines reminded her of the crystal towers from her memories. The ship's captain appeared on their screen. Her silver skin shimmered like moonlight, and her purple eyes were proud and free. "I am Captain Dawn of the Starbringer," she said. "We've heard about a freed Starborn aboard your vessel. We've come to offer her a place among her own people." Thomas looked at Lyra, his face carefully neutral. "The choice is yours," he said softly. Captain Dawn explained that the Starborn had established a hidden colony after generations of slavery. They were gathering their scattered people, rebuilding their culture. "You can be among your own kind again," she said. "Learn the old ways, help us grow strong once more." The offer pulled at something deep in Lyra's soul. Her own people, free and proud again. The chance to relearn everything that had been stolen from her. But when she looked at Thomas, she saw the pain he was trying to hide. "I need time to think," she said. That night, she couldn't sleep. She wandered the familiar corridors of the Star Wanderer, touching the walls that had become home. In the observation lounge, she found Rose waiting with 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might be up," the doctor said, offering her a cup. Lyra sat, wrapping her hands around the warm drink. "How did you know?" "Because I've seen that look before. The look of someone torn between 2 worlds." Rose sipped her tea. "My grandmother had it when she left her home world to marry my grandfather. Said it was the hardest choice she ever made." "What did she choose?" "Love." Rose smiled. "But she never forgot where she came from. Taught all her children the old songs, the old stories. Said being part of 2 worlds made her richer, not poorer." Lyra stared into her tea. "The Starborn colony. It's everything I thought was lost forever. My heritage, my people's ways." "You can have both, you know," Rose said gently. "The colony isn't going anywhere. You could visit, learn from them, bring their knowledge back here. Unless." "Unless what?" "Unless you're afraid." Rose's eyes were kind but knowing. "Afraid of choosing, of taking that final step from being free to truly living." Lyra thought about the past months. She thought about Thomas defending her to his family, standing against slavers, always giving her the freedom to choose. She thought about the crew becoming her family, about movie nights and shared meals and laughter. She found Thomas in his cabin, working late as usual. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the resignation in his eyes. He was preparing himself to lose her. "The Starborn colony," she said slowly. Would we be able to visit sometimes?" Thomas blinked. If I stay." Lyra stepped closer, her heart pounding. "If I choose this ship, this crew." "You." He stood, hope breaking across his face like sunrise. "Lyra, I would never ask you to give up your people." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." She took his hand, silver fingers twining with tan ones. "I want both. I want to learn about my heritage, to help the colony when I can. But I want to come home to the Star Wanderer, to you." Thomas pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "Are you sure? Really sure?" Lyra smiled, feeling tears on her cheeks. "When you freed me, you gave me the right to choose my own path. This is my choice, my free choice." His kiss was gentle, almost reverent. When they parted, he brushed away her tears with his thumb. "I love you," he whispered. "I think I have since the day you first smiled." "I love you too," she said, the words feeling like another kind of freedom. "Now help me write a message to Captain Dawn." We had a lot to tell her about how humans and Starborn can work together. The garden behind Thomas's family home bloomed with earth flowers and transplanted crystal blooms from the Starborn colony. Lyra stood before a mirror in Mary's old bedroom, watching as Rose and Emma helped adjust her wedding dress, a blend of human white and starborn silver, flowing like starlight. Something borrowed, Mary said, fastening her grandmother's necklace around Lyra's neck. Though I think you should keep it. It matches your skin perfectly. 6 months had passed since Lyra's choice to stay. In that time, the Star Wanderer had made 3 trips to the Starborn colony, carrying supplies and returning with knowledge and artifacts of their culture. Each visit helped heal old wounds, building bridges between 2 peoples. Captain Dawn stood in the garden below, her white uniform pristine, talking with Thomas's father about trade agreements. Other Starborn had come too, drawn by the unprecedented nature of the union. Some humans in the town had protested when they heard about the wedding, but far more had sent gifts and well wishes. "Ready?" Rose asked, adjusting the final fold of Lyra's dress. Lyra touched the necklace, remembering the frightened slave she had been just a year ago. "I've been ready since the day he freed me," she said softly. "I just didn't know it then." The garden was full of people, the crew of the Star Wanderer, Thomas's family, even Uncle Bill, who had finally apologized after getting to know Lyra, representatives from the Starborn colony, and local officials who supported their union. Mark stood as Thomas's best man, while Emma served as Lyra's maid of honor. Thomas waited under an arch twined with earth roses and Starborn crystal flowers. When he saw Lyra, his eyes filled with tears. She walked toward him on John's arm, each step taking her further from her past and closer to her future. The ceremony blended human and Starborn traditions. They exchanged rings and energy promises, their joined hands glowing with shared power. The local judge spoke of love and commitment, while Captain Dawn performed the Starborn blessing of unity. "In the old days," Dawn said, her voice carrying across the garden, "Starborn believed that true love could bridge any distance, heal any wound. Today we see that it can also bridge the gap between worlds, between peoples. Let this union stand as proof that the future belongs not to those who would divide us, but to those who dare to love freely." Thomas's voice shook as he spoke his vows. "Lyra, when I first saw you, I wanted to free you. But you freed something in me too. The courage to stand up for what's right, to love without fear. I promise to spend my life making sure you never lose your freedom again, and to love you across all the stars." Lyra's silver cheeks shimmered with tears as she responded. "Thomas, you gave me freedom, but more than that, you gave me the strength to choose my own path. I choose you today and every day. I promise to stand with you, to love you, to show the galaxy that love knows no boundaries." When they kissed, the Starborn among the crowd released streams of energy into the air, creating a dance of lights above the garden. The humans applauded, and Rose wiped away tears. At the reception, Thomas and Lyra announced their plans. The Star Wanderer would continue its trade runs, but with a new mission, helping to free other slaves and transport them to safety. They had already set up a foundation, with help from both human and Starborn supporters. To the happy couple, Mark toasted, raising his glass, and to freedom. Later, as they danced under the stars, Lyra rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. "Are you happy?" he whispered. She looked around at their gathered family, human and Starborn together, talking, laughing, sharing stories. She thought of the work ahead, the lives they would help change, the future they would build together. "More than happy," she said. "I'm free, and I'm home." Above them, the stars sparkled like promises, and the future stretched out before them like an open road through space. They had proved that love could overcome generations of prejudice, that freedom was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply choose to love.